Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Heart of America. Today, we have a very special episode, kind of a departure from our usual mode of operations, which is that we have a specialist in the field of regenerative agriculture. And this person is highly regarded in the field, used to be the CEO of Rodale, if you're familiar with the Rodale organization, which has done tremendous work promoting composting and regenerative and organic gardening for decades. And so we'll be talking with him, but we also are going to be talking with a group of people, some of whom, like many of you out there, watched the film Kiss the Ground and got excited about, is this a solution that we could really work toward quickly to try to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through regenerative agriculture. So what we're going to do for this episode, it's going to be different in that we have a group of people here who are part of an organization called the Corazon, which is a new initiative in the Pajaro Valley area, which is south of Santa Cruz, north of Monterey, and around Watsonville. And it also sort of bleeds into the Salinas Valley, which is a huge agricultural area in the state of California. This is a major agricultural area in the state of California, and California produces something like 30% of our produce for the whole country. And Timothy would know more about that. If that's incorrect, Timothy, please correct me. Timothy is going to be our special guest, but I'm going to quickly introduce just a few people who are on the line with us. And they include Ann Lopez, who is the executive director of the Center for Farm Worker Families. And she is also an emerita professor and has taught courses in biology, environmental science, ecology, and botany in the biology department at San Jose City College for many years. She also has a PhD from UCSC in environmental studies. Her bio goes on and on. But I'm just going to skip to the next person here because we don't have all kinds of time. And I'm just amazed reading these bios. I'm like, wow, my friend Batya, where is Batya's here? I got to find here. Here we go. Batya Kagan is on the line as well. She's been a climate activist with me in Extinction Rebellion. And I was reading her bio and thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't know all these things about Batya. She got her bachelor's degree in environmental studies at UC Santa Cruz and taught outdoor science camps for 15 years and worked to restore sandhill ecosystems in the hills of Bonnie Doon and Ben Lomond. So she's done restoration work. She was on the steering committee for Transition Santa Cruz. She also went to COP21 in Paris in 2015. I did not know that, and also wrote a thesis on the psychology of greed and how the relatively new practices of eco-psychology by professional therapists can reduce the addiction to increasing profits. That sounds amazing, Batya. And then also we have Adam Bolaños-Scow, who is working for CORA now, the Campaign for Organic and Regenerative Agriculture. That's what Corazon stands for. And one of the main goals of this group is to phase out pesticides and convert Pajaro Valley to organic and regenerative farming. So that's what these folks want to do. Conventional farming is causing many health problems for local residents, especially children, and especially the migrant workers and their families. Yes. Adam also ran for Congress against Jimmy Panetta, our local congressperson here, who, that was quite a challenging run because the entire, Democratic Party machinery is aligned behind our current congressperson, Jimmy Panetta. But he made a good run, and we're hoping he might run again. Adam is also working with the group working on Measure U ballot in Watsonville to create growth limits and protect valuable farmland. He's also a violinist and works with youth in Watsonville and Hollister. So those are the bios that I have. I'm going to ask other people to introduce themselves as they pipe up with questions. And now I've got to introduce our main attraction, Timothy LaSalle, we are so excited has joined us today because he's a busy person and he's been a global speaker on regenerative agriculture, decades of background in the field. He is currently an adjunct professor and co-founder of the Center for Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems at Cal State University in Chico. And that's where the fires were. If you're not from California, when we had a huge fire, I think it was the Paradise Fire, was just right there at the edge of Chico. Chico took a lot of refugees, as I understand it. So at the heart of, some of the impacts of the climate crisis, the center is leading and providing science-based hope for a regenerative food system that will mitigate climate while providing the most robust, ecologically regenerative method with the most promise to feeding a growing world population. LaSalle previously served as the first CEO of Rodale Institute, executive director of the Allen Savory Center for Holistic Management, and he was research coordinator for the Howard G. Buffett Foundation in Africa on soils and food security for smallholder farms. He is Professor Emeritus, California Polytechnic State University, Cal Poly, and served as President and CEO of the California Agriculture Leadership Program. He lives and works on his farm in Atascadero, California. Welcome so much, Timothy LaSalle.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here and to be here with, to me, this esteemed group whose commitment we absolutely share is how do we convert our lands to regenerative and how do we restore our environment, as well as start to affect the nutrition levels for humans. Amy, thank you for the invitation. Anytime we get a chance to visit about our really only practical approach at addressing climate change through soil, I'm always ready to step up and share what information we have and the vision we have. Batya, I just want to say, and listening to your introduction here today, I appreciate your psychological realm. I didn't put into my bio one very late in life degree. I finished a PhD in depth psychology, and my dissertation was Awakening to Ecocide. Because, so many of our choices are made on the unconscious level, not the conscious level. I knew depth was the realm for me to deal with, and seeing the ecological decline of the planet, because I've been in 98 countries around the world over the course of decades. And I seen the degradation. Just being in China the first time when everybody was on bicycles to today, when we are all driving automobiles. Well, let me get back to this. Let me reground this and go back to the soil. And I would like to share my slides here today and then go through what I think is some pretty exciting and positive conversation points with regard to, and it looks like I started on my last slide instead of on my first slide. So let me just end that and go up to the beginning. And let me just say that often I am just not hopeful with regard to where we're headed as a society when I talk about ecocide. But if we're looking for solutions, there are some. If we're willing to commit, we can actually make a huge difference with regard to climate change. I too attended a COP meeting. It was COP15 in Denmark, and it was one of the most depressing experiences I've ever had. And I was asked when I was living in South Africa to go to the one that was at Durban by a number of different groups. And I said, no, thank you. And then listening to what's come out of COP26, again, if we're even talking about 2050 as our goal for carbon neutral, we're basically assuring our own self-destruction. So those are far too slow goals, and we will be in serious and dire straits well before 2050. Yeah. So let's just think in terms of, in essence, where our carbon in the atmosphere has come from, and about a quarter of it has actually come from our soil. And David Montgomery wrote some good pieces about a loss of soil, but in essence, agriculture is a main problem that could be turned into our strongest asset. What happens is soil carbon is kind of lost by the way we've been treating and farming. Actually, for 10,000 years, we have been clearing forests and tilling. So that's why there's so much of the legacy carbon in the atmosphere has come out of the soil, which means those soils are less fertile and less able to produce food. The other thing with tillage comes fertilizer. So you see what we have here is problems both for conventional agriculture, which we like to demonize all the time on their high inputs. It's a system that was developed on input, a paradigm about bringing what the plant needs instead of helping build in the living soil what the plant can acquire. And that's an understandable paradigm, but fertilizer use has been one of those problems in killing the biology. In organic, we seem to be able to kill the biology too, because we till a lot often with organic. So both systems degrade soil and release carbon. Both systems can also produce fairly nutrient poor foods. And that's where when I was at Rodale, I wrote an early paper on we could capture all the carbon. But I said regenerative organic at the time. That was in 2008. I was discouraged from using that term even by Rodale at that time. In essence, it has to be regenerative or the organic will not do it either. Now I want to say to this group, my wife and I eat and grow organic, but I don't use the term anymore. And the reason is we have to reach all farmers around the world. And organic only represents about 1% of the land. So our audience really is the non-organic farmers in so many ways. And let's remember that, 6 years ago, FAO told us we had 50 years of topsoil, 60 years of topsoil left. It's 55 years now. So we have two existential crises facing us today. That is climate change, which is going to happen a lot sooner than 55 years. That could be very existential for societies. And then definitely the loss of soil, which produces our food. So what are we doing about this? Where's our focus? Is it where it needs to be? I just want to show these pictures just to show these are contemporary pictures. These are not based in the Dust Bowl, but the erosion in the upper left-hand corner was the field right next to my research fields in South Africa, and it was very sandy soil, and the weeds were growing so bad, I just asked the farm manager if he would disc those weeds down so they wouldn't go to seed. And then 2 weeks later, a rain event happened, and there was the soil that washed away. And I go, oh, what I did. I, just said, knock the weeds down and look at the soil that washed away. The one in the upper right-hand corner is a picture in Burundi. My wife and I worked in Burundi for a couple of different stints with the Buffett Foundation, trying to move that towards conservation agriculture. Almost every square inch of Burundi is tilled, and their colleges teach tillage. It's hand tillage, but it's tillage. And I had to say to them, what did they love about the Egyptians so much? Because they were giving away their most precious resource source every time it rained. And they going, what are you talking about? And I just show them this picture and remind them their rivers one of the sources of the Nile starts in Burundi, and it runs maybe a quarter of a mile as clear water before it turns muddy brown, and there it goes. The lower right-hand corner is actually a picture of my neighbor here in San Luis Obispo County. We don't have to go to Africa to find erosion. In my county alone, San Luis Obispo, most of the grain land is tilled, most all of it. And this is what happens to it if we get rain. And I just recommend David Montgomery's book. David's a friend, but Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization. It's a really critical corner piece to thinking about how do we stop tillage and how do we begin to do work on that. And at Chico up there, we do have research going on that, even for vegetables. But here's an example in Ghana. Now, my wife and I are working with Kofi Boa, who does a tremendous job of teaching regenerative systems to smallholder farmers. And we had set up some experimental plots with him there in Ghana. And the cowpeas in the background there is a successful crop. You can see the beans on the top of those bean plants. And the front plot is also cowpeas. The difference in treatments between those two plots was tillage. The one in the back was not tilled. The one in the front was tilled. And there you go, breaking up the soil structure and the fungal communities, and you have a crop failure when you have rain shortage. So there's the part of resiliency, building soil, starting to hold carbon back in. And that was just after 1/2 of a season, not even one full season. There's the difference made by the tillage question. So wow. This kind of thing, when I kind of show the soil samples on the left picture are from my little farm here in Atascadero. And the ones on the right are from the research I was doing and the practicum I was doing at South Africa. And the center water samples with that aggregated soil still being held together, and the middle two bottles of both pictures where the biology was working, where no till was involved. And actually on the left side, my Atascadero parcel, I had been doing teaching a course in my barn, and I walked away from it. And 10 days later, I went back in. I go, oh, I should have taken a picture and dumped those samples out. That's 10 days later, that soil is still aggregated. So it wouldn't wash away in the field. It would not blow away in the field. And it was still friable. It would break apart. It had wormholes in it, had aeration holes in it. Whereas in both cases in these pictures, the left-hand bottle or jar was tilled soil in adjacent fields, and see how both of them disaggregated. In other words, they'd wash away. And the biology will help glue soil particles together. And this is why biological regenerative is a crucial element to moving our systems forward to hold and build soils for the future, and also capture carbon. When the news media caught wind of this Icelandic plant, the orca plant that would capture carbon, it could capture 4,000 megatons of carbon dioxide per year. That means we need like 2,325,000 of those facilities. That would cost us about $127 trillion. And I often just say, if we just helped farmers plant cover crops, get the biology going, it would cost so much less. And we'd get all these other ecosystem services at the same time, because we know we can capture a whole bunch of carbon. Our technological mindset takes us down crazy ideas and thinking that doesn't build the living system back. It's trying to suck it out of the atmosphere, where we know photosynthesis does that and feeds life at the same time, not just mechanically. While in South Africa, what sort of elevated my consciousness to the rationale for biology was I created a system with no outside inputs. The only thing I purchased was seed, and I did no-till, rotation, and cover crops. I was in phosphorus-poor soils. All soil tests would say you don't have enough phosphorus to grow your crops. I never applied anything, and I increased those yields 5 times the local smallholder farmer. And so I knew it was biology. I just didn't have the microscope or the training to determine what was going on, but it's made me be able to think in terms of how do you really focus now on feeding that biology. That should be our soil focus. So when we look at data points, nobody's talking about these kind of data points except a few of us. These are what most scientists would call outliers, and we throw these farmers out because that's just, they're outliers. They don't fit in our data sets, and they don't. And actually, some of us, like at Chico and other places, we are saying those are the people we actually want to look at, because they're offering solutions, whereas the conventional numbers would not fix much of anything. So I'm going to start on the right, Russell Hedrick in North Carolina, and you can go online and watch videos of his, what he talks about his farming in North Carolina. We're working with him. He'll probably be a part of a huge research project we're going to do in 4 states. But Russell was able to, and he's taken his own data, he was able to figure this regenerative thing out, and he broke the record for corn yield in North Carolina at 301 bushels. This year, he just broke the soybean yield at 111 bushels. Now, he is not fertilizer free, but he's, like his example in his corn, he's 1/2 of the fertilizer use that his neighbors are, and sometimes 80% less. So what happens is he knows he greatly increases his profits. And that's our communication to farmers, is how do you increase profit? Gabe Brown, many of you have heard of Gabe Brown and maybe read his book, From Dirt to Soil. And Gabe just won the Heinz Environmental Award, which it's been good. I was on part of his recommendation group with that. He does not use any chemicals anymore, yet he doesn't bother to certify organic. He's in North Dakota. There's not a big following for that, but he's measured the nutrient density of his food now. And in essence, in his meats that he sells, they are much more nutrient dense than any neighboring or grocery store meat that could be had. David Johnson in this picture from New Mexico is a guy I met when I came home, and David was showing these same kind of levels of carbon capture per hectare per year. And in essence, he was doing it in trials on the university campus, just on his own, as an offshoot of another project he was doing. And so we've made him an adjunct professor at Chico too, doing this research now on multiple farms. And we're trying to do a huge project to be able to get the attention of climate policy people. And Doug Aller is one of the farms we're doing the research on. It's one of Howard Buffett's research farms in Arizona. And all of these you see from 11.6 to 8.5 tons of carbon per hectare compares with this chart. And that is to say, the conventional discussions, and Al Gore has the thing going on right today. And he had called me once a couple of years ago because he wondered about doing such and such. And I said, I'm just not going to participate with the old numbers. And Ratan Lal in this chart, 2004, is one of the speakers that's on today on Al Gore's panel. And Ratan has finally gotten up to talking about 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. Urs Niggli in Switzerland, my wife and I have visited him and his projects. He's more in 1/4 of a ton. And West, with the meta-analysis of a whole group, is less than 1. He's about 0.7. Whereas the 4 farmers I just talked to you about are averaging over 10 tons.
Wow.
So that's why our focus is on those. That starts to solve the problem. All the rest of this research and the conventional processes, and Urs is in an organic and biodynamic system, and Ratan and West are more in the conventional commercial systems that use the fertilizers, et cetera. They're not solving the problem. They're not even bringing agriculture to net zero yet. Whereas these 4 farmers would bring it not just to net zero, but into a huge drawdown component for climate change. And that's where we're focusing, and that's what we're trying to pay attention to. What David Johnson explains to us from some work that Elaine Ingham and others have looked at is that if you look at most soils that are tilled or soils that have had chemicals used, they are very bacterial dominant. And those are very good for weeds. Weeds love those soils, and weeds help transition those soils. And weeds are a big problem in a lot of our farming systems. And part of the reason is they're bacterial dominant. But if we can get those to at least a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, 5-to-1 fungal to bacterial, more fungi than bacteria, we start to move into agricultural crops or vines and bushes. It's when it gets to the 100-to-1 to 1,000-to-1, we're in forest, and that's when it's just fungal dominant. And you don't see weeds in forests. They couldn't grow there, but you have all of this communication, all this capture of carbon that even a lot of the forestry people are not measuring as carbon capture. They're looking at wood and roots, but not even this whole living system under the surface of the soil. It's a huge carbon pool that comes out of the atmosphere and goes down into that soil. So we're trying to get fungal dominant soils. The more we're paying attention to this, it seems that this is a very important part. Some colleagues in Australia that started farming a number of years ago are in a very dry area, and they didn't use any fertilizers. They just inoculated with something similar to what David Johnson has shown, and David's work is on our web, and that's inoculating with fungal dominant. And their barley yields started to double what their neighbors were doing. So today, these people who own no land now have 20,000 hectares while their neighbors are going broke. The interesting thing about the picture on the left is that there's green grass now growing in a dry time in those barley rows after the barley's been harvested, and they turn their sheep out into that grass. Mm. Well, that is a C4 grass. In other words, it's a perennial, a deep-rooted grass. It hadn't been in that region in 40 years since it started farming. But just by adding the biology, the seeds were stimulated to germinate again, and the grasses returned. And so this is, again, working with nature, working with the biology and the living nature of soil, an example of that. And you see the root hairs are just full of soil because the biology is alive in that rhizosphere. Here's what happens with the root hair. When it has biology there, it needs what the biology brings. And it signals to that biology that it needs a boron element, or it needs phosphorus, or it needs more nitrogen. And the sort of negotiations go on at that point, and the biology says, oh, I need to eat. I need sugars and carbohydrates. So here's the root in this visual exudating sugars and carbohydrates to feed the biology. When fertilizers are used, there's no need. So the plant's not doing this. But that is what Christine Jones from Australia terms the liquid carbon pathway. What are sugars and carbohydrates made of? But carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen primarily. And carbon is being now exudated into the soil to feed the organisms, which they themselves can become 50% of the organic matter in that soil. The organisms can. And what you see is roots on the right. This is one of my former fellows in the Ag Leadership Program. His roots on the right, he loves to call them his successful dreadlocks, that are full of soil, still sticking to the rhizosphere because all those sugars and carbohydrates are exudated, versus the roots on the left, which didn't even go deep because they were taking nitrogen fertilizer in. No life there. So you have carbon capturing systems on the right, maybe carbon losing systems on the left, healthy, vibrant, biodiverse systems on the right, kind of inert, kind of dead systems on the left. And that's the difference. This fungal network is such an exciting thing for us to understand. There's a lot of kind of popular books out now about forests and fungal networks, and those are really delightful to read, and it gives us a whole different image of a forest. But in our cropping systems, when we reestablish fungal communities, we can expand the root surface area of that plant by at least 50 times.
Wow.
So you end up with so much more opportunity to find water if it's a drought time, to find that rare boron element that it might be needed and transplant it, transfer it, and bring it back into the plant because the plant needs it in their signaling. And so it can demineralize more phosphorus. It's bound up in the mineral matter and is not available to the plant unless these fungal communities are there. So this is the network and the living system that we're trying to really enhance and restore the way nature created in this bartering, exchange, life-giving, vibrant, interdependent system. You know, at Jena University in Germany, they found to really enhance this biology, you needed to really have lots of species of plants. And they said, if you kind of move from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 plant species, you're going to go from producing about no nitrogen in that system, or the biology is, to 100 to maybe 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And that's the interesting thing of why multi-species cover crops are really crucial, not single species cover crops. We often think, oh, I got to plant a legume to get my nitrogen. Well, that nitrogen is in the root and it's being saved for when the plant needs it, and particularly when the plant goes to maturity and starts to make its seed. But what's happening here, there's 22 species of free associating nitrogen fixers when you have a diverse, healthy soil community, and those become available at all times. A single species will never give you the resiliency nor the quality of the soil because not all of the organisms are being fed well. This is a prime example. Christine Jones, let me use her slide here, that the photo on the left shows triticale in Canada in a rain-short year that was a failed crop. In the background of that picture, shown more clearly on the right, is triticale in a multi-species mix with the same amount of rainfall. You actually probably could harvest that out of that system because multi-species does a whole different dynamic with the fungal communities, with use of the water, and it shades the ground from actually evaporating water. So we're doing a study in Blythe right now trying to look at cover crops versus fallow and saying, where are you really saving water, let alone building soil health, soil aggregation, soil organic matter. So these are important ideas to incorporate, as multi-species is a crucial element of building the diversity of organisms underground and the health of the plant and the health of the system. In the Johnson-Sioux composting scenarios where they make this inoculant, here's a vineyard up on the north coast of California that was trying, this is on the right, versus just the inoculant, this multi-species fungal dominant on the left. And you see the cover crop that was inoculated did 2 to 3 times better than a compost, which we always think of as a good nutrient additive. Compost is great, but you can sort of make your own soil without compost, their own fertility without compost, if you get all the organisms in place and you create sort of more multi-species above ground. My friend Howard Buffett that I went to work with in Africa, he made this point, and that is that it's not a green revolution we're after. And the Indian Green Revolution, did it even work? If you look at some of the recent books that have been written and some PhDs have been done, there's sort of some evidence that says all the crops, not just Borlaug's wheat crop, increased in yield because rains came those years those studies were done. We know that the green revolution in Africa's failed twice, and Gates keep dumping money and training people to try and replicate what they thought was a successful green revolution in India, in Africa. It will fail unless we go with Howard's term, brown revolution. How do we invest in the soil? And this is a way, I'm trying to educate Howard on this now, because he's been all about it, but we're trying to educate him to the realities of it's the biology. It's the biology. It's really feeding the biology. And that's how we invest in that. So David Johnson's work, as we're replicating and trying to learn from, really is paradigm changer, is moving from a geochemical idea of soil and an input consciousness of soil. We got to bring the phosphorus or bring the nitrogen, if it's in compost or if it's in fertilizers, to a living biological system, and moving to a fungal dominant, not a bacterial dominant soil. That's going to let the biology with quorum sensing, the self-fertilization all take place. We're moving this paradigm from maybe a half a ton of carbon per hectare per year to 10 to maybe even 20 tons of carbon per hectare per year. That's a huge paradigm change. And in crop productivity, we think we can increase that as well without those costly inputs, or with very little of those costly inputs. So when I came back to California from Africa, because I knew we had to work in the US, this young lady worked at City Farm, and I said, show me that arm one more time. And she hadn't really shown it to me. And I said, my goodness, to her, I said, I've seen commitment before, but nobody has tattooed photosynthesis on their arm before. And I said, why? I love it. And I just have to have a picture of it. And she goes, well, I always kind of forget the equation, and I don't want to forget it. This is what we're trying to support. And one of the things we learned is with Johnson's work, is photosynthesis efficiency. Now listen to this. The efficiency of photosynthesis can be improved. And it's not about we're doing better than what nature can do. It's when we really support nature through these cover crops, through building the biology, the efficiency, the amount of carbon coming out of the atmosphere and being pushed into that ground, making that ground more fertile, can be enhanced. And that's the really exciting part. So regenerative agriculture, as we've defined it in Chico, is farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil, organic matter, restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. Actually, the ecosystem services run many-fold, not just water, biodiversity. We're also seeing the data on nutrient density of food. When that biology is in place, that's where we're seeing the nutrient density, because those fungal communities bring the nutrients to the plant, making it healthier, making, therefore, the food healthier. What we know is if we graze differently, we can change landscapes. We can turn them from deserts into photosynthesizing, biodiverse, productive landscapes with the same amount of rain. And so there is a chance, if we change the way we looked at our land and how we supported the biology, that we could, through regenerative, robust practices, take us back to our pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There is no other way to do it, because this is affordable, it's available, and it will feed the planet, as well as improve water cycles, as well as absolutely draw down our excess carbon dioxide. So I'd like to stop there and open it up for conversation, questions, comments that any of you may have with regard to this topic. And I'll do stop share. And Amy, back to you.
Thank you so much. If you've just joined us, actually, I'm feeling like I'm on the radio show. Yes, thank you so much. Anne was clapping for you. For those of you who are sort of from the general public, we're talking about, can we actually regenerate the earth where we're farming and solve the climate crisis? Some of us watched the documentary Kiss the Ground, and this is a conversation about how do we do that in our own communities and our own backyards. Most of us live somewhere adjacent to some kind of farmland, even if we have to drive an hour or so to get there. And this is a conversation about how can regular folks get that done. I know that Timothy also works at Chico, which is, my understanding is trying to help California farmers convert to regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of issues with that, but clearly we need to do this and do it as rapidly as possible. So Adam has a question, and I'd like to ask Anne if she has any questions, because I know she has to leave the earliest. So let's go to Adam, who has his hand up, and this is Adam Scow, Adam Bologna-Scow, who is working with Corazon.
Thanks, Timothy, and thanks, Amy. To what you were just saying, Amy, the question is, I think a lot of us are totally excited about where we want to go. The challenge is how to get there. And so my question would be, can you describe your success in working with both American or California conventional farmers, and how you've persuaded them? How many farmers have you persuaded? How do you advise going about that? Because we see that as a pretty kind of where we're at and the big challenge before.
Adam, thank you for the question. So farmer transition is a big thing if we're going to fix climate, and that's so that's changing a whole system and a paradigm. And it usually takes 100 years to change a paradigm, and we don't have 100 years. We know adoption theory, when we look at adoption theory and think in terms of the innovators, the early adopters, the late adopters, and then those that are recalcitrant and won't adopt, that's a whole nother question. Let me address that in just 1 second. First, I want to say that our primary efforts was to research, demonstrate, and replicate the kinds of systems that we've talked about today. And right now we have on the books, and we're going to start fundraising. It's probably about a $12 million project we're looking for the support for. In 4 states, we're going to use flux towers. We're going to use it's not even fully developed yet, but they will be ready by August, is soil probes that can measure all kinds of things and be remotely read. We're going to compare all of that with core samples down to a meter. We're going to then compare that with satellite data and satellite imagery. And we're going to work in 4 states with farmers. Chico State will be one of those farms, but others will be regular farmers from both coasts. And our intention is to, again, try and show the distinct differences in contrasting conventional agriculture to a robust biological regenerative. Because if we can get that data, that becomes a bit of a conversion point for farmers, as long as we bring the economic piece to it. So yes. Both Cindy Daly and Cindy's our director, and I said I would go back to work in the university only kicking and screaming. But anyway, after all these years, 30 some years being out, knowing Cindy and working with her, we just got to sit down and said, both of us came from conventional farms. Both of us ended up transitioning to organic, teaching it, doing it. And both of us knew that wasn't quite enough. And we moved to the regenerative, and so we created this center together. And in essence, we knew we had to stop using the O word around farmers. So among this group, we can probably use the organic word just fine. But as I said, organic can also destroy soils. So we don't use organic in that. In transitioning farmers, we need an open dialogue. And Kiss the Ground asked me twice, one of the funders, to review that movie before it came out. And I kept saying, you are bashing conventional agriculture, stop the fight. Stop the fight, we need them. Now, among people that are more organically focused, they go, yeah, that's right, that's right. Well, that's the divisiveness in this country right now. We need to break that apart and drop that argument. This is an all hands on deck moment. Yeah. We all have to be here. So we need to include all of those farmers. And Adam, that goes to your question. How do we bring them in to look at regenerative? Well, we have to talk about dollars and cents. That's why we have economic pieces in all of our studies. And the next thing is soil health. How do we not just reduce their costs of inputs, but how do we then build for the future, for their children, or for just next year? And so that's the approach we take. I knew when I came back, committed to working in the United States, because this country has to change if we're going to change the world. And the issues around hunger and starvation and water and poor soil, we could put the Band-Aids on it or fix some small spots, but we have to change it on a bigger level. It's part of why I came back. But I also knew a lot of farmers here in their political ideology were climate deniers. So often, even though our focus is we know what we can do climate-wise, we don't talk climate because we don't want that fight. And if they go regenerative and they're building the soil health and improving their profits, even if they don't believe in climate change, when they go to bed at night, they're capturing carbon for all of us and for themselves too. And that's building the system. So that's how we started, Adam, is talking about economics. And that's why we're keeping the economic piece in all of our studies and our communication. The next part is understand that in adoption, one of the biggest impediments is peer pressure. And if somebody goes out and starts, just like if you're an organic farmer next to your neighbor and you have some weeds, they go down to the coffee shop and make fun of your weedy patch, you know? And we've watched organic farmers quit organic farming because they didn't like the peer pressure. So we have to, and I think right now, the way or this regenerative movement is happening, it is catching on very fast. And farmers are more open to this because it doesn't say it's an all or nothing. And they're seeing sort of the energy behind it, including companies, and some multinational companies are in conversation with us because they need a pathway to make their companies carbon neutral. And the only way to do that if they're buying food is to change the way the farmers are farming. So they're trying to incentivize it for the farmer. So that's another lever in this system, and we need multiple levers. We need policy changes. And you know, California is trying to invest in this, so let's give them that credit. But it needs to be put in the right places. But policy changes can help farmers make this transition. And on a national level, we've got to stop subsidizing the degrading sort of corn and soybean efforts that go on in this country. And we got to turn it to this other piece. So I'm also working with some people, dear friends of mine, that are investing heavily in developing these soil probes. And part of the reason I'm pretty excited about that is if we can find an inexpensive way to measure carbon in the soil remotely, that can be, therefore it can be accounted for. We can throw all carbon models out the window, which we need to do because there's such a focus on this, just like Al Gore's doing today. I won't even listen to his thing, talking about the middle level, 1 ton of carbon per hectare. That doesn't fix anything. Now this 10-ton fixes it. So let's give those farmers credit. They don't fit in these models. We need actual accounting, in soil, on farm accounting. And then if there's going to be payments, pay them for it. So if you're for carbon markets or not, they're here, they're coming. Most of them are based on models. I just hope we can push back on the modeling and going to actual real numbers. So outcome-based will also, I argue, incentivize farmers who are innovators usually, many of them are, who know their own land and will adopt the kinds of practices that work for them. And that's therefore not a practice-based run. And I think that's really important. So Adam, I could go on with a whole bunch of other impediments, but those are things that we're working on, we're thinking about, we're trying to apply some energy into to help farmers convert. We also have model farmers or ambassador farmers, training farmers that will train others that we're working with. And on our website, those numbers are growing. And we have a couple of thousand, well, thousands of people from 70 some countries that are following this work now. And so we know we're making a difference, and we don't get to hear from them all. And if we did, we wouldn't have time to hear from them all. But there's a lot of other people doing this work too. Adam, you were going to say something, so please go ahead.
Oh, no, thanks for that very comprehensive answer. I guess so. One thing too, just part of the follow-up thinking is, is there a definition of regenerative that is important? Because I understand the divisiveness around organic. First of all, Santa Cruz County, where we live, the organic standard is largely developed here as a legal standard. So we're kind of already an organic capital with lakeside organics and all. So I'm just kind of wondering, culturally, aren't organic farmers the ones most likely to go regenerative? Is that your experience? But then my follow-up question is, for conventional farmers who don't want to go organic, is there a way for them to kind of cheat and go regenerative and continue to spray pesticides and herbicides that are making us all sick and destroying the soil? Is there a loophole there that we need to be cautious of?
So that gets into that can get into politics and get into ideology as well as science. I mean, I'm not going to deny the poison issues around what you're talking about. But for one thing, let's be clear about the organic world. We know the National Organic Standard Boards have been eroded. We know that label doesn't mean what it used to mean. We know that the soil, the building soil is no longer really actually monitored and stuck to. And we know that the Organic Standard Board has now included hydroponics, what happened to the soil, because of corporate interest. So my friend Dave Chapman at Real Organic, I really support their work with regard to trying to bring a focus back to the soil. So much has been eroded in the organic world, sadly. With regard to the regenerative piece, wouldn't organic farmers be the ones that would really turn to regenerative if they would return to the idea about soil and biology? But just like at Rodale, I kept asking the farm crew, why don't you stop plowing? Don't you see the erosion as that soil washes down the hill? And they go, you just don't understand. We've got to use it for weed control. I do understand. That's why I went to Africa to work with Buffett to go no-till and no outside inputs, which means by default organic. It's a kind of thing that Howard, as a Midwesterner, was not hot on organic, so I didn't use the word with him, but it was a biological approach. Now, can regenerative farmers utilize chemicals? Yes, they can. They can still be using some insecticides, some herbicides, some fertilizers, and still building their soil because they haven't killed off all of the organisms. And one of the examples I give is there in Arizona where we're going, we had the question, could we build biology with GMOs and Roundup and insecticides? And you know, I'm against all of those poisons personally. Yes. Well, we did that 11 tons. And I'm just going, whoa, okay. Now, does that mean we just let them keep doing it? Well, we don't want to control that. It would close the door for a lot of conversations. But what happens is they see, just like Gabe Brown, he weaned himself off of fertilizers. And his point is this point. Gabe will always say, I'd rather sign the back of the check than the front of the check. And there's where you get them off the chemicals. Because once they see they don't need them, they're not going to buy them. And the farmer in Arizona said, you know, Tim, I'm going to be spraying for mites on this corn twice a year. At the end of the very first year, he said, you know, I only had to spray once. So we just cut the pesticide use in half. And if you'd come to them with an organic conversation of getting rid of them, you would have changed nothing. And to my organic friends, I said, our approach is going to get more chemicals out of the agricultural system than trying to cut them all out, because that's not going to happen. They don't know how, they don't have confidence, and sometimes they are just philosophically not aligned. But talk to them about money and profit and saving money, and they're going to see they don't need this, they don't need that, and they're certainly not going to buy it at the particularly expense. If you listen to farmers today, conventional farmers, one of their biggest concerns is the price of fertilizer. And we're showing them a way out. We're showing them a way to greatly reduce. And so that's where I think that we're going to, and I kind of go back, I still say to my organic friends, we're going to get rid of more of the chemicals than you could ever dream of. You're only 1% of the land. We're trying to deal with the 99% of the land. And we're going to move most of those back into the storehouses of the chemical companies.
Good. Good.
Mm-hmm.
So Ann, you just mentioned something. Thank you, Adam. You just said a few short words, but I'm wondering if you'd like to ask a question, since I know you have to leave in about 15 minutes.
Well, I thought that Timothy's explanation is beautiful. I mean, it's just so comprehensive. And refreshing, and it's like there's hope. But just to give you an idea of my position on this, I have understood a lot of the biology that you describe, but my concern has been working with farm workers and seeing the impact of these horrible pesticides on their lives. Average life expectancy 49 years, and then to see the impact on their children, especially with cancer, ADHD, autism, and learning disabilities. It's been too much to bear to meet all these families with children with these conditions, and farm workers are the poorest of the working poor and least able to provide these children with the services that they really require. So I see what you're describing as definitely a path forward and to stop the carnage in the farm worker community. I mean, it's disgraceful. This would not go on, I don't believe, in any other wealthy white neighborhood, what I'm seeing in Watsonville. Right. It's a clear classic example of environmental racism, and why this county, liberal, progressive Santa Cruz County, tolerates this is just something I don't comprehend. So anyway, I don't have questions. I think your presentation was comprehensive and excellent, and I thank you. I bow down to your work.
And thank you for your comment. I don't know anything more painful than the kind of conversation you just brought forward, and I don't know anything more sad to think that as a society that we permit this to happen, and that there is legislative lobbying influence that actually ensures that it's going to happen. Right. And so it's a very difficult for me, and it's part of the conversations I used to have when I get up and speak when I was CEO of Rodale, because I would pound home those. And there was an anthropologist out of Florida that did a study on the Yaqui Indians, those that had worked in conventional fields versus those that moved up on the mountain, and the neurological damage done to the children in those fields was one of the saddest things that you could imagine. And I know, because my wife's worked in the natal units and hospitals, but one of her friends went down to Santa Maria with the farm workers, and the number of birth defects were off the charts. So we know, I mean, those of us, you and I, and those probably on this call, know about these things. And yes, there needs to be legislation. There needs to be all kinds of things with this. But what I've tried to do is, where are the biggest levers in my lifetime that I could pull to make the biggest difference? And so instead of in that fight right there, how do I show a farmer how they can save the money and not purchase those to ever come on the farm to start with? So it's a different angle. I hope it's inclusive. Again, I come back to, it's all hands on deck for climate. We need everybody. So what language do I use to get everybody?
Yeah, whatever works.
Yeah. Yes.
So we have another question from, I think, Kathleen. Were you going to ask the question?
Yeah, and since Woody and I didn't introduce ourselves,
Great.
I'm Kathleen Kilpatrick. I live in Watsonville in the Pajaro Valley, and 50 years ago, I lived in a hippie commune up in the mountains of Eastern Washington, and was a believer in the Rodale Bible. Did a lot of organic farming there, and then I kind of re-entered through the healthcare realm. But for years, I did social and environmental justice work, as part of my spiritual practice, essentially. And we ended up moving back to California, and I got a job as a school nurse in this Pajaro district, which has a large population of farm workers. And when I came to work here, my boss said, she knew my background. She said, don't talk about pesticides because the growers run everything here. And so I didn't. There was plenty for me to do, taking care of our high needs community. But later on, I got back involved through my union, because teachers are often very strong supporters of social justice and pesticide, safety and things like that. So I got back into it, and then I started working with Safe Ag, Safe Schools, which is under the umbrella of CPR, and kind of like the science person, the nerdy person. But
Kathleen, I'm just going to jump in. Are you leading up to a question?
I am leading up to a question.
I'm just saying, because I don't want to take up, I want to make sure everyone has a chance.
So,
thank you.
I had this vision for the Pajaro Valley, that the Pajaro Valley could be a model of a community that works toward reducing pesticide exposure and toward more climate-friendly agriculture. And Cora kind of came along and reinforced that vision, but I'm just trying to figure out what you've been talking about, how it would apply in our little valley, where over the years, it's become just almost all berries, other than Dick Peugeot and the other small organic farms who sell most of their produce in San Francisco and Berkeley, and not here in the valley. How this would be something that we could use for berry farmers. When we moved here, there were cover crops, fava beans, Sudan grass, clover, whatever, and they'd plow them in, and then they'd plant the berries, or they'd plant broccoli and they'd plow in the broccoli, and then they'd plant berries. But now it's hoop houses and raspberries, or fallow fields and strawberries all the time. And it's because the land is worth so much that they just have to keep producing these high yield crops. We could blame it on George Bush or whatever, but people like strawberries better than they like broccoli. So, how this could be adapted to the particular economics of our valley, which has a history of having some of the richest topsoil in the world, but it's being depleted as we watch over the last 20
Kathleen,
years.
I think that your question, that this is a joint venture, because it's not me with the answer, it's us with the inquisitive and innovative minds to find this answer. So first of all, let me just speak on behalf of the first George Bush. He didn't even like broccoli. But anyway, let me just come back to
I thought that's what I said.
Yeah, to the point about, because we are doing research with, actually there are 5 organic large vegetable growers in the state, and then at Chico up there with Cindy Daly with some vegetables. Vegetables are one of the hardest crops to start to really capture carbon, because they're multi-crops during the season, and they do plow them or disc them back in, and that destroys the soil and the fungal communities and releases carbon, and you're degrading the soil, and they bring more inputs in. And then if you're hoop housing, you're monoculturing, and what are you doing for the biodiversity of the soil, et cetera. So we're going to have to find, and I talked to a viticulture group up in the North State, and I reminded them, I said, I'm not a viticulturalist. Actually, I'm a dairyman. But anyway, the point is that let's come back and say, let's get innovative about this. So one of my friends, he was a former student of mine when I was a professor at Cal Poly, and he became chairman of the board of Metropolitan Water District. That's 13 million people and $1.4 billion budget. And we just had coffee this last Saturday, because he has a vineyard up here in Paso Robles. And he, through a podcast I'd done, heard about regenerative. I want to do it. So a vineyard's a pretty monoculture crop. And if it's distant in between, it's very, very degrading to a system. And so he's planted cover crops, and he's brought sheep in. And, the winery, and after 1 year, the winery says to him, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing. This is the best juice we've seen come in here. And he said to me, he says, thank God I only have 1 more year left with that contract. He says, because they're not going to pay me any premium for that, even though I have a little lower yield right now, but I have much better product, because the biology through the sheep, through the rumen, through the manure, the urine, and particularly the saliva has re-inoculated and changed the biome of his land. So how do we restore the biome, the soil biome, in these systems? With a lot of disking and plowing in the vegetable fields, it's going to be a challenge. And we haven't solved that yet. We still have to keep working on it. I think there are some things, we're looking at some things, some innovators are doing it in certain areas. but we haven't fixed that yet. In a hoop houses, very intensive, expensive land, single crop. How do we do that? I have a friend here locally, John Swift, who's doing subtropicals in hoop houses. On the other side of the hill, you could never do it here. We get very cold on this side of the mountain, but on the ocean side over there, they stay a lot warmer. And he's looking at those things and making some of those modifications. And I think what happens is it still comes down to how do we help the farmer make money in the system, figure it out creatively, innovatively. And we know biology can reduce input costs. We know it can reduce, and if the plants get healthier with this biology, it can greatly reduce sprays, insecticides, et cetera. What will absolutely happen, and Chabousseau in France 10 years, 30 years ago, wrote a book about this in vineyards. When you bring that Brix level up in that plant, you bring the health of that leaf up, those insects go next door, particularly to fertilized crops that are weaker. And it's just like a lion in Africa looks for the weak animals on the side of the herd. The insects can't eat the high levels of sugars in healthy plants. And they have to go look for other hosts. This guy, I was just telling you about Randy Record in his vineyard. He said, we've had mealybugs in one corner of our vineyard for years. He said they came this year and then they left. So we didn't have to spray. He said, boy, my neighbors had a terrible infestation, which just illustrates the point I made. They left and went to the neighbors. And so that's the kind of thing that we can help them with if we can get innovative and creative and try and work or do our own experiments in our own backyards to kind of help make this happen. Get the innovative farmers. Let's try this. Can we help you try that? We will pay you a premium in our farmers markets if you grow it regeneratively and with sort of these methods. And let's all hands on deck. And you are in the more difficult crops. We know how to do with almonds. There's a monoculture. We can really make it regenerative. They have a lot of space between those trees. We can grow multi-species cover crops. We could even on short-term graze if we wanted to in between, but we can manage those. We can greatly reduce. We have a walnut farmer up in Orland, who started doing cover crops and roller crimpers, just like we used at Rodale. And he stopped using fertilizers and sprays. And he says, I still have a little bit of mite, but he said, and my yield's a little bit lower than my neighbors because he doesn't put any fertilizers on. It's all cover crops. He says, but their cost of production are $2,800 an acre. My cost of production are $800 an acre.
Wow. What a difference.
So he has some of his neighbors following him. And that's, he was an innovator. He was a creative one. So we're going to have to do this together. It's not all prescriptive. You do X, Y, and Z and you're there. They're complex systems. Monoculture makes it harder. How do we get it more diverse? There are ways. We'll figure it out if we put our minds to it and are open-minded.
So I'm just to summarize a little bit, I'm hearing you say that we need to talk about economics, that we need to find innovators who are willing to be sort of like the guinea pigs or the pilot projects for this. And then I'm also sort of hearing that they're the ones who are going to influence the other farmers probably more than a bunch of, hippies, Not that we're all hippies here. We're not, but some of us are.
It could be worse. You could be a scientist. I mean, what the hell? I really won't listen to you. Yeah. But listen, Amy, here's the point is that I was talking to a guy who has a very innovative soil lab. He does a great job. We were actually in Hawaii together on a project. And he said, I was making my presentation and telling the farmers what they need to test in their soil and the biological this and that. And he said, I would explain all to them. And he said, I was really helping them out. And he said, and then the next speaker was a farmer who was succeeding at this. And he says, and then they were all in the front of their chairs listening. He said, not to me, it was to the farmer, because the farmer had skin in the game. And that's what happens in this scenario too, while we try and work with farmers who are willing to share. They have skin in the game and other farmers listen, for sure.
That's great. I want to make sure we get to Batya and then Ellen with questions.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy, for that great presentation.
Right. Yes.
I too, I came by Rodale as an intern, actually. I interned there and watched them do their plots, and attempted to talk to conventional farmers about the different farming practices that they were trying to demonstrate. Anyway, the reason I state that is because one of the questions I have is, you know, like you said, we need innovators to show, and I agree. And I'm wondering if there are, first of all, if there's a program within your center that is trying to get land, get innovators to start things up, or do you need us to do that to get things started up so farmers can see for themselves? Because I 100% agree that we had a couple of farmers come to our last, we did a forum, and they just left shaking their heads like, you know, that you guys are full of it, basically. And so I think farmers are mostly show me people, like, you know,
Yeah.
you can speak a whole bunch of words, but I think they're
Right.
show me people.
That's right. That's right.
So I think, so I want to know if there's a program like that, B, if there's money to help incentivize some innovative farmers to do such a thing, because it is a risky thing. It's a big output, and sometimes the transition time doesn't always occur like in that year that you're talking about. I mean, I'm impressed that it happened within a year, but I wonder how long that may not be in all systems that you see
Right.
that kind
Right.
of
I agree.
quick turnover. So any help you can have on the financial end of incentivizing. I know you're in California, so I know that there's been some, you know, there's the Healthy Soils program, but I want to know what kind of monies are out there. So I'll stop there.
So yeah, California is putting more money into this now too. So that's really a positive. And you know, in Northern California, Cindy Daly was able to acquire a $7 million grant to really train all northern counties, NRCS people, RCD people, and farmers on regenerative ag. And so there's a training that's going to happen, and some are applying and some are coming into that. But your point comes back to farmers, and it's not easy, but we do still need farmers to talk to farmers. But I'm going to cite an example of some of that challenge. If you go online and look up Russell Hedrick, and that's Hedrick, he's a friend of mine in North Carolina. And there's like a 54-minute or 45-minute or whatever video of his. I wished I knew the name of it, but he tells this whole story. It's about a year old or a year and a half old, maybe two. And he was not a farmer, and he came in and just learned and looked and watched videos and figured out and became very, very regenerative. And he hasn't gotten rid of all chemicals out of his system. He's the one I talked about getting such high yields in North Carolina. But he told a story on the phone call the other day that he said that he would hold field days. And he said he had people from 4 different countries and 20 states come to his field days. So they were coming to learn. You know how many people from his county, farmers from his county came? 0. They were looking at his farm. They're saying, hey, Russell, you got mushrooms growing in your corn. You better get those mushrooms out of there, or they're going to kill your corn. And in this video, he says, I didn't know mushrooms could walk around killing corn. He goes, you know, well, what happens, it actually was an indicator that his fungal communities had gotten up, and it was the healthiest thing he could do, but it was foreign to his neighbor farmers. He said they would never come to his field day. But in 2015, and my wife and I were in North Carolina for a little bit in that summer of 2015, as we came back from Africa for a couple months. And that was a drought year. They had 4 inches of rain. And he's out planting his corn, and his farmers' neighbors are coming over and say, gee, can you plant my corn? My cedar will not penetrate the ground. And he's trying to say to him, it's not the cedar. My cedar won't penetrate your ground either, but it'll penetrate my ground because I've been regenerating it. And they just walked away. At the end of that season, the average yield of his neighbors was less than a bushel an acre. And he had gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 bushels or something like that. And that next year, everybody came to his field day because they're going, wait, you know, you had a crop, we failed. And so it sometimes takes something that serious before they'll pay attention. Otherwise, they're going along their merry way. So even farmers aren't always it. And often, like Gabe Brown, none of his neighbors have changed to his method.
Huh.
At Rodale, nobody changed the organic processes we were doing. The neighbors typically don't do it so well. It comes back to that peer pressure. So yeah, having demonstrations. There's a friend of ours that started an organization called Vayda Farms, Vayda, and he has gotten investment money from one of the Canadian Teachers Retirement Associations who want to invest in regenerative agriculture because they want to do good. It's not the maximum return for their retirement monies, but do good in the world. And we're talking with him. We may do something in Chico with him, but he has now a farm in Mississippi and Texas and Missouri. And the idea is not only to turn it into regenerative, to make it a demonstration farm and a teaching center to help other farmers get there. So probably I'll have to have a field day and invite people from other counties because probably the locals won't come, but that's all right. I mean, but we all need to do this. So can you get it done right in your valley? Perhaps with the right people. And if they see the dollar return, I used to jokingly say, you know, the next guy who drives to the coffee shop in the biggest, newest pickup, they're going to pay attention to, what are you doing that I'm not doing? But, you know, how do we, what are the signals? How do we communicate and how do we invite people in with this and encourage and not create divisions best we can? Ellen, your hand has been up a long time here, so patiently. So
I've been learning all along. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've really, really enjoyed this presentation. And I want to say that my background was working as a technical advisor for the Healthy Soils program for the California Department of Food and Agriculture, sort of as a cheerleader to get people started in this, because I don't have as much technical background as some other people who are very successfully doing that advising now. But what I got the picture of was, you know, we said at the very beginning of this presentation that most of the food for the United States is grown in California. And I've just always thought that was really unbalanced. And maybe we took the markets away from the Midwest and got a lot of communities, you know, just doing those subsidized crops instead of growing food. So I'm wondering, because we're probably going to be in a continuous drought for a long time, is there a way that we can incentivize farmers here to do the regenerative work, the, you know, multi-species cover cropping, to pay them for increasing the carbon in the soils and sharing the market with other parts of the country?
So, you know, those markets would come into play in the other parts of the country, because in Illinois, a farm used to be an orchard and a little bit of a truck farm and the pigs and the cattle and the corn and all of that. And now it's not, you know, those farmsteads are just a corner of the property and it's all corn and soybeans. And what changed that? Well, Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture, just a few years ago, you know, who said, get bigger, get out. And the whole ag program moved towards those commodity-based systems. And so now the National Corn Growers Association, now Soybean Growers Association, Farm Bureaus, et cetera, they're all oriented towards the commodity-based, ethanol subsidized agriculture, CAFO systems. And we do need to get out of that. I mean, there's no question. Those lands in Iowa and Illinois, all of those Midwest states, they could return to a more diverse system if the incentives were there. So it's not about us giving it back to them. It's really about the farm policy shifting. And if we incentivized for other things, and if we did carbon budgets about shipping, hauling, refrigerating stuff long distances, and there were some sort of, you know, if we had full cost accounting and we had to pay for that, more locally produced food, you know, would be pretty marvelous. It was interesting, a number of years ago, there was a study done, like Chicago got something like 5% of their food from the 4 states around Chicago. And you go, what? You know, those are ag states. What is this? So, I mean, you know, it's the way policy shifted farming, get bigger, get out, and it went to commodity-based, you know, Cargill's, Archel Daniel Midlands, Monsanto's, John Deere's, that all aligned with this mass large acres scenarios. And now a lot of the farmers don't own their land, or they own very little of their land. It's owned by investors. And so the incentive to reinvest in that soil isn't as strong for the farmer, because he or she doesn't necessarily have that farm next year or not
Let me-
long term.
Can I add one little thing? I just want to say in defense of Dr. Ratan Lal, he is now promoting a third leg of the stool for the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Healthy Soils Act. And he says without those three legs, it doesn't stand. So we really need to do something nationally about healthy soils as well. And I think regenerative ag is the way to promote it.
Well, Ratan Lal is a colleague and a friend, and you can say something positive about him. He still doesn't say, I tried to get him to publish one of these articles in his thing, and he just doesn't understand the biology that well. He's a genius. He's world renowned in soil science, carbon capture. And yet this is the paradigm. What's your training? What's the new paradigm? And sometimes it's hard to grasp it for any of us, not just Ratan. I mean, he's a genius, but it's hard for any of us. And yes, we need those three legs. But you know what I often said, the soil carbon starts to address all of those. And I think he'd agree. So you build soil health, get more of that carbon cycle going in the biology, which I'm not sure he's quite fully in that realm yet. But then the water cycle improves. The health of the water leaving the property or percolating improves. And you end up with more carbon out of the atmosphere, which he definitely agrees with, and it ends up in that soil. What I think is really neat is in the new research, it's showing 50% of that carbon can literally be the bodies of the dead biology, which we always thought in terms of leaf matter or roots. But no, these are single cell and multi-cell organisms. And that's really important. So no, it's important. Atmosphere, water, soil, plant health. And one of the things that we like to describe soil is to say, what is soil? And we would like to say it's the plant, it's the root, it's the biology, and it's the mineral. And it's not soil otherwise. It's just dirt. Because you need that living, whole system of life. And that's what took 6,000 parts of carbon dioxide, per million, 6,000 ppms down to 280. It was that whole system. It took it all. People would argue it took the grazing buffalo in the Midwest with the inoculant in their saliva and manure and the deep-rooted C4 plants to pull that carbon down in those plains and to make those deep, dark soils. They're all part of that process. And so you can't just say it's that dirt. Yeah, dirt is dirt.
For the general public who might not be tracking what you're saying, as people might not be so climate aware, but you're talking about a period in history in the past when there's a huge amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How many parts per million?
6,000. There were no large animals then, obviously,
Right.
but they ended up getting 8-foot tall fungus that were starting to pull this carbon dioxide out, reducing it, cooling the planet, and making all of those carbon stores in the soil.
Yeah. What was that period? Do you know the name of that period?
There's two names to it because there's a verge between one starts with a D and one starts with something. Let me see. I might have it.
It's not that important. It's okay.
I might actually no, it's not, because that's just facts that rattle around in our brains, and you love to tell it at a cocktail party. But what?
Well, while you're looking, I just want to say to folks that we are now at 415 parts per million. And that's a number that's measured daily at the Mauna Loa Observatory on the Big Island of Hawaii. And it's been said that if we hit 420, that's it. So we are very close to
tipping. We're going to hit it soon. We'll hit it soon.
Probably going to hit it soon. So we need to get on this now. Right. For the, I don't see any more hands up. So I'm going to ask a question, which is, look, these folks are going to go out and be talking to farmers. I have some more sort of detailed strategy questions about that. But in terms of your regular person who might be watching this, who consumes food, who buys food, who maybe is going to go and vote. I don't know what the Biden administration is doing, but where do you, in terms of focusing on this solution to climate and also to the biodiversity issue, what would you recommend your average person be doing? Like forming a group like this? I want to push people to, come on guys, it's all hands on deck, just like you said. What would be some of the most effective?
All right, let me respond. I'm not going to answer it, but I'll respond. But first, let me say that the first I'm going to answer your first question. It's the Ordovician and the Devonian periods,
Okay.
400 million years ago.
Okay.
So that's when that was at that peak. Now back to your point is what do we do? You know, about 4 years ago or 3 years ago, was invited to present to Whole Foods about this, and then a couple of years ago, I mean, they really heard it, and I was invited into Austin to open a whole day session to talk about regenerative ag, and they said they were going to take a year to think about it. By the end of that day, they said, we're not going to take a year, we're going to go regenerative. I'm not sure how far they've gotten right now with regard to that. I do know Mega Food, it's a supplement and vitamin company, because now I kind of work with them. We have a big project going on their turmeric and ginger in Hawaii that they source from a farmer. He's the former Californian. We're working on building the organic matter, the biology, et cetera, in that system. We have a lot of other projects. I'm not just talking about this one. I'm just saying that with this one, they are committed. They're a B corporation that cares about the environment, their workers, and the profit. And they're doing an amazing job of tracking the carbon. So one of the things is some companies are starting to track, and I would try and find those and encourage that. Two is, one of the things they used to say when you used to walk into supermarkets, if 6 people asked for a certain product, it would show up on the shelf. How do we start asking for it? Regenerative, verified regenerative. It doesn't mean a label, it just means verification. It means outcome-based. And get the consciousness moving in the food system more and more. Most food companies are going to want to get there. This will help stimulate it. The next thing that I would say is know your farmer, and start to ask the farmer what they know about regenerative and what are they doing to build that soil. And so you're going to learn a little bit about what, you know, you're going to want to hear from them about multi-species cover cropping, about, you know, reducing tillage, about how do you start to feed the biology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those kinds of elements. And so then support those. And then I love your group that's focusing on this, because it's going to come with better thoughts than I have today, more innovative and creative and locally relevant thinking about what can help and change the way we farm. I sit on the board of Groundswell International, partly because they're a platinum-based nonprofit. I mean, they really spend the money on the ground with indigenous NGOs around the world, and they're an agroecological regenerative approach. And I want to make a difference globally, because I want hungry people to be able to eat and have soil that can produce food and capture carbon too. And so that's another way that we can participate with something like that, like with an organization like Groundswell International, who already know about this soil component and why it's going to help women and farmers and families and nutrition and climate and water, and are investing in that as an example. So to me, there's lots of levels, and I would say we are global citizens first. You know, if we can't do it in our own backyard, we can at least do something in somebody else's backyard, even if it's in Ghana, and that we can make personal choices for sure as to how we purchase or grow our own food.
Thank you. Batya.
So I know that I've been hearing rumblings in the Biden administration, as well as from our governor here in California, about specifically about getting carbon into the soil. They know it. It's important. They're making it a priority in policy, and yet I'm not really, I guess I'm not tracking it well enough, and maybe you're not either. Maybe policy isn't your number one focus, Timothy, but I'm wondering, you know, well, first of all, I am concerned about the greenwashing aspects that, you know, everybody's talks regenerative, but it's, you know, it might become big ag once again, and that is a danger I'm concerned about. But mostly what I'm trying to ask is, do you see policies coming out of the Biden administration or here in California that are promising? And again, I still feel like there must be funding sources. I just can't believe that there's this much interest without there being more funders out there who, you know, you say that there's investors that are in charge of these farms. Well, pretty soon, aren't they going to see that their farms are going down. They're not going to get the water they need. I mean, here in our valley, strawberries are the most one of the most water intensive crops. Aren't they going to be ending up going, yikes, we don't have enough water? I mean, it's going to be almost a requirement. And so I'm just wondering why aren't there investors out there just ready to hand over the money and say, here, make a pilot project, give farmers the transition money? I'm just curious.
So there are some investors coming into this world, but I watch them be reticent. I watch them, still be tight-fisted. I watch billionaires that are going to want to make this huge return again and just collect more money themselves. And yet I watch somebody like Veda Farms I'm talking about that really cares about the good of the planet right now and wants the thing to really move forward for everybody. And so it's just the whole diversity of human motivations and intentions and what they're trying to do that I see going on right now. With regard to policy, I got pulled back to DC a few weeks ago, and they pulled us in to brief some congressmen and senators' offices and their staff. And, I used to go in and out of DC when I was at Rodale, and I was really tired of it. And the money, actually, Leon Panetta told me once, he said, Tim, he goes, you're not going to get that very far. You don't have the same money level as Monsanto. And he was anti-Monsanto. I mean, Leon was not a supporter of Monsanto, just because you'll never get past that kind of influence there. Well, as we briefed, and we started out with 2 Republican congressmen staff and then a Republican senator from Mississippi, as conservative as you can get, the reception was so positive to the kind of story I shared with you on climate, on soil, on stop the flooding, stop the killing of the Gulf of Mexico, improve nutrient density of food, let's fix climate. They immediately wanted us to write bills. They wanted the wording. They wanted to know how to do it. I don't have time. I don't have money. I just got pulled back to do it. They're begging me to come back, and I'm still trying to focus on getting the data, getting the research, getting things happening, here too. I do know politicians are using the term. The greenwashing aspect is why I say outcome-based only. Outcome, give us the measurement, the verification. I don't want labels. I don't want, whatever definition you want to throw at me. Just show me you're building the health and carbon levels of that soil. And then we know it's regenerating. And that's a verification that we should all demand, and we should not let legislation go through otherwise. I know Biden, I know actually Buttigieg, I know others continue to use the term. I can't tell you how versed they are, because most of them are given their talking points by their speechwriters. So I just don't know how versed they are. But when I saw this interest, and the Republicans wanted us to brief their climate change caucus, I almost wanted to say, what is that, 2 people? But no, it was 22 people. They wanted to know. So it has a potential for bipartisan efforts in DC, and we should act fast. I don't have time right now. I mean, people need, and we need to go for these robust numbers. We need to at least reward those, create the incentive to go to those, because as Amy just said, we have such a short time left on parts per million. I mean, we're really toast unless we do this. And so, let's write and talk to your congressman, which you all know who yours is, but it's also others, and if you know people that go there, let's get this moving. We all have to do it.
Thank you. I love that passion. It touches people. Kathleen or Woody?
Hi, I'm Woody Rehanick. I'm a retired special ed teacher, and I was a farm worker in Washington State, both organic and non-organic. But I was one of the presenters at our town hall, and one of my suggestions to our city council was that they somehow incentivize a transition to organic and or particularly regenerative agriculture. And I was thinking, I came up with this idea, to your knowledge, has a city council ever bought carbon credits from farmers? Here's why. Here's more of the preface. The City Council of Watsonville approved a climate action plan a couple of weeks ago, 2030. By 2030, they predict with renewables and electrification, they're still going to be 100,000 tons short of zero emissions. And then at the end of their plan, they say, one way we can make up the deficit is through regenerative agriculture and tree planting. And habitat restoration is a third one. But then they go no further. That's it. They're just penciled in at the end. And so my idea, and I sent my slideshow to city council members, was maybe the city council could somehow recognize or incentivize carbon credits to farmers who are already doing carbon sequestration. Somehow realize this is a good time in one sense because our city manager just took a job in Santa Cruz. He got hired by Santa Cruz. So I'm hoping to pressure the city council to hire someone who puts climate action first and foremost on their agenda. Also, several council members are being termed out. One is ill and so on. So we're going to have a change in city council, change in city manager. Do you think that's a worthwhile avenue? We've been talking about, state and federal level. What about the local level? How best to leverage climate action change toward regenerative, in your opinion?
I'm glad you're in that community. Do it. Go ahead.
Timothy, I just want to add, county employees are about to go on strike, and one of their demands, besides cost of living increases and hiring more staff, is actually committing to and acting on their previous county-wide commitment to carbon neutrality.
Great.
It just occurred to me, and that's the whole county, which includes Santa Cruz and Watsonville and the Pajaro Valley.
So we cannot get to carbon neutrality without drawdown, and we can't fix this 400 some parts per million without drawdown, and we can't do that without the trees and the crops. It just can't happen. We need the photosynthesis working in the wetlands, and those all have to be restored, and we've got to be planting trees like crazy and changing our agriculture to regenerative and outcome-based. The city of San Luis Obispo is committed to that net zero, and they know they have to go through agriculture and tree planting. And so they're starting to develop those plans to try and get there. But you're right, if you don't incentivize it, I mean, you can't just throw another regulation on somebody.
What are the incentives that would seem effective to you?
Yeah.
Well, I think the suggestion just made is, can you buy the carbon credits from the farmer and have it outcome based? I mean, show us the carbon in your ground that you're growing. You're accruing it every year, and it's real, and we'll pay you for it. One of the things that, I used to always say is people that were against carbon markets, and I'm against a lot of them because aggregators and speculators and whatever are the big winners in that. How do we get the farmers to be the big winners in that? And then it becomes a legitimate transfer of payment, which means I'm a carbon emitter every day. And when I buy my food from someone capturing it, then I'm transferring my externalized cost of carbon pollution to somebody who's mitigating it. That's a legitimate full cost accounting. It's not a tax, it's not a penalty. It's actually paying for the cost of my living in a carbon emitting way. So I think it's a legitimate, non-liberal, conversation. It's actually very conservative because it's saying I'm responsible and I will pay my share for what I am damaging or whatever, and I will repair it. So I have to take responsibility for the repair of what I've damaged, and that's a transfer payment, straight up.
Could I ask an add-on question?
Yeah, sure. I don't have any answers. You can ask anything.
Okay. I picked up Time Magazine and I saw this full-page article it's called Carbon by Indigo, right in the middle of Time Magazine. I couldn't believe it as we were preparing for the town hall. Do you know about them? They claim that by next spring, they will be able to measure the carbon content of every farm, of every farmer on the planet.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see, because the technology that I know about that and them is that's like a maybe and an estimate and maybe a model. And models, I do not subscribe to.
So it's a
just-
modeling, it's not a measuring, it's a modeling.
Yeah.
They say they will verify it by in the
Yeah,
ground.
so there's
testing.
that means they have to be going satellite. And if they're going satellite, I want to see the correlation values that they're showing to real. And at what depth are they measuring that soil carbon? And here's my point about that is in the biology, when you get more root depth and the biology going deeper, another part that's typically not understood is the biology will emit a lot of inorganic carbon. And a lot of the carbon that they're trying to claim and they're looking at is biomass, it's whatever. And what is that correlation value? And if that's really high, and they've got the data to prove that, then I'll listen a little bit more closely. That's part of the research we're going to do, because we're going to correlate satellite data to flux tower data, which is very, very intricately and exact, to soil core samples, to these new soil probes. We want to see what the best, cheapest, most inexpensive way of monitoring carbon in soils and at depth, because we're going to go at least a meter. We know in some cases that carbon's going much deeper than a meter.
Yeah.
But we can't afford to track all of that. So yeah, I just know they had billions of dollars come into their company. They're out to make a profit. Do I trust that? Not yet.
Thank you.
Okay. So I have one more question. In the thing that the presentation you gave in DC at the press club, you were talking about the politics of scale and about how we need to get this working at scale, which is why we're working with you're working with soy and corn farmers and all that. And there's just a lot of balkanization about who eats what, and are cows good or bad and all that. But what we're thinking about for the valley, is just a strategy. And when we're thinking about scale, we're talking about Driscoll's and Well-Picked and Giant. Those are the big wholesalers, and they buy the berries from the farmers. Most of the farmers who farm in this valley now do not own their land. They are essentially sharecroppers. So if you were going to approach Driscoll's, what would be the strategy that you would recommend?
Well, I would try Driscoll's for sure. And I used to know people there, but I don't know that I do anymore. But the second part as I would do is I would approach Driscoll berry purchaser, and Whole Foods is one of those. And I would approach them, because what are their requests of their suppliers? So I was speaking at a Harvard gathering last week, and the lead speaker was the CEO of Nestle. And in my generation, Nestle is one of the worst companies you could ever surface. Well, this CEO was so committed to regenerative agriculture and has tens of thousands of farmers around the world and working with them and supporting regenerative, that I'm kind of going, well, I better open my mind and have a conversation. I don't know if I ever get to talk to that guy, but I better open my mind, because that's a big purchaser of food, biggest one in the world. And if we get them on board, and I hate this because I'm a local guy, local economies, local food, but there's no time left. So it is all hands on deck again.
Right.
They're part of the big hand that we need to get involved in this as fast as we can. So I would go to the purchasers of Driscoll, and then I would see, what the heck, are there any farmers that will grow berries regeneratively, that will figure it out and do it? And then how do we just get them known all through your community? And so that even Driscoll's has to pay attention. I mean, they may be small, but it's like, where there's a demand here, people will pay for that, and get their attention somehow too. So I would use all avenues I could think of and find out where I could have an influence and time to affect it. And then I'd approach it.
It makes me so sad to think that farmers are not owning their land. I feel like, is there a way we can help with that? I don't know, but my sense about farmers, and correct me if I'm wrong, this whole group has a lot of expertise. I'm happy to hear from anybody. I feel like maybe they're averse to organics because of liberals. There's a sort of rural urban divide thing going on as well, but I feel like they care about the land that they're on.
Right.
That they probably care about species. They probably care that it looks crap or it looks or it's either supporting life or not. They must care. And I wonder if that's something to even talk about.
Amy, I think if you go back to financial return We
Yeah.
can help you make more money and build your soil health. So all biodiversity and all that's going to come into building soil health, and that they'll learn that, you know, as they go into the system, as they start to save money.
But we
For the
don't
general-
say
for the
that. We don't
general
say
fund.
biodiversity.
Often not, often, but
Don't say anything
yeah.
good.
That's liberal. That's you tree huggers, you know, that's just you tree huggers out there talking about
Oh,
biodiversity.
gosh.
I gotta make a crop. If your mindset and your education, which is most all of us in this country, is reductionist, you think in terms of how do I produce the most I can there, and bugs and the birds and all that stuff, they're pests. Just get them out of here and I'll produce you your food and stop complaining. All right. Not understanding it's a whole living system that can become very robust. You know, I never sprayed my corn in Africa. And did I get corn earworm? Yes, I did. How much damage did I get? Almost none. How come? I had birds everywhere. They'd go into that ear of corn, pull that worm out. It was delicious for them. And my biocontrol, you know, and it was, didn't have to spray, no cost. So, you know, until we get to that, and we also need to get to an idea around here, because farmers will say this, consumers just won't buy blemished product. Well,
Yep.
we need to get away from that, you know. If you could see me more clearly, you'd see I have blemishes too, for Pete's sake, you know. Let's
No.
we got to love it all. Come on. So let's go.
Yeah, I think that the trend in this valley, and I probably would have to do more investigation, but there were a lot of farmers from different cultures who bought land here and farmed the land themselves, and they kind of got to the age where, okay, and it, what's her name? In the book Wilted, she talks about this.
Dr. Julie Gooseman.
Yeah, Julie Gooseman, about how, okay, I can still be a farmer, but I don't have to farm anymore. And so they lease their land out, and quite a few of the farmers in this valley are people who came up from being farm workers, and they came from Mexico knowing how to farm. They may not have been farming raspberries and strawberries down there though, so they just pretty much do it the way everybody else is doing it.
Right.
And they need to make their money to have a profit as well as pay their lease, so they
Right.
do it in the way that they think is going to help them get by. So, and it's pretty hard to, because monocropping berries in this valley, as I think Julie Gooseman demonstrates in her book, it's not sustainable, but
In the
they're
long
just
term.
trying to get by and make a living,
No, it's
a good living. if they
Roland
can.
Bunch wrote the book 2 Ears of Corn. Great. He's the first guy that showed me what regenerative meant in the 80s in Honduras, building an inch of topsoil a year, which textbook said couldn't be done. But he and I sort of coined a term for a while. We were tempted to write about it, called dead end agriculture. I mean, these soils are being depleted. It is a dead end. There's not a future. Just my introduction, we have 60 years of topsoil left. That's dead end agriculture. We're coming to an end. So we have to turn back to building and restoring. And sadly, Amy, yes, a lot of the land now is not occupied, farmed by owners. It's farmed by leasers it's the only way they can afford to farm. And a lot of the money, the investment goes into hard assets like land or real estate. It's what's happened to the housing market. It's also happened to agricultural ground. But yes, you're on mute, Amy.
I was wondering if you knew what the percentages are in terms of how much farming land is owned by actual on the ground local farmers and how much of that land is owned by large corporations.
I don't recall that number, Amy, and you're asking me to continue to deal with very depressing data.
I'm so sorry.
I don't recall, but it's there's a lot. I know in the Midwest, a lot of that land has been purchased by people from Chicago, people from the city as investments. It's a diversifying your portfolio, which all the business schools teach you to do, and we've lost the ability of a lot of farmers to hang on to it, being squeezed out, and then it ends up in the hands of people who can afford it, not the neighbor farmer, and it's an investment in long term. And it's proven to be a very effective investment, sadly.
Yeah, isn't it true that the Chinese have bought a lot of ag land?
Yeah, I've heard
Oh,
that.
that's an old criticism. There's been some of that happen, but if you look at it, it's not a lot of Chinese. It's not a lot
Oh,
of Japanese. It's not there's been some. There used to be real estate, et cetera, in that. But I think you can say the Chinese bought a lot of our bonds, and they have. They probably bought a lot more of our bonds than our acres. But that's just a global investment strategy.
Well, I just wish the farmers would realize that the hippies really want to help them. We could really be a good team, guys. If we'll come out to your farm, we'll have a potluck with you, and we'll do some talking, and we'll help you out.
A lot
You're
would
on
like that,
side.
Amy. Don't back away. Go do it.
Okay. Or
Bhatya, you had a comment?
Plan. What?
Did Bhatya have a comment?
Oh, I was just going to say it's kind of ironic that people want to diversify their portfolios, but the portfolios aren't going to be about diversified farms.
That's a good catch. Good catch.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, so we've got about 4 minutes. If there's one last comment or one last question, it's been really rich, and I'm so glad. Yeah, Woody.
Well, it's partly comment, maybe a question. We have extreme fumigation because, conventional chemical, what they do is they lay sheets of plastic, miles of it, and then they pump fumigants underneath, T-lone and chloropicrin, which is used in house fumigation. Now, I'm trying to track where that goes, and no one can tell me. I'm coming up with
Woody, just from the standpoint of time, do you have an alternative? And actually, we do have an alternative, but they don't know about
Morimoto.
So
he's doing alternative fumigations.
So without fumigation, usually they're fumigating for nematode or they're fumigating for fungal communities. Both those can be addressed with the right kind of inoculant that is a fungal dominant, because a lot of fungus will repress the damaging fungus. And in nematodes, when you get really healthy organic matter in the soil, you get the nematode eating nematodes that come in and control the nematodes. And so organic matter is one of the best. I was called to Abu Dhabi once. They were fumigating the hell out of their soil. They had to eventually take all of their food and just dump it in the toxic waste dump. It was so chemicalized. They couldn't control the nematodes. They couldn't control the insects, and they had dead soil. And I said, huge compost levels and soil organic matter. Build that system. Well, in beach sand, it's hard, but you can do it. But that's the whole thing. There all are alternatives that also capture carbon. But one of my former graduate ag leadership programs used to be head of pesticide regulation in the state under Schwarzenegger, and I went to try and talk to her about this. She goes, "Well, it's more complicated." And I thought, yeah, you've been listening to the chemical companies. It's not that complicated. It's politically complicated for you, but it's biologically not complicated at all.
Thank you.
All right, guys. I know Bhatya has a hard stop at 2:30. Thank you so much, Timothy. I actually am not really immersed in this issue, so I'm sort of a researcher and a reporter. And so when I found you, I said, "Oh yeah, I'll ask this Timothy guy." And then when I shared who you were with the group, they were like, "Oh my God, it's Timothy LaSalle."
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and your commitments and your love of planet Earth and your desire to make a difference. Thank you. It was a delight to be with you. And yes, please.
Thank you.
Together we can, and we just have to do it. So thank you for
If
the
you find a
opportunity.
strawberry farmer, send them down.
Yeah, exactly. Or raspberries, right? Yeah.
Or raspberry, berry
All right.
farmer.
Thank you, Amy,
Thank you.
for organizing.
Thank you
so much.
Yes, thank
Sure.
you.